I'm going to ask everybody who isn't named Sarita to mute themselves. So, Sarita, you unmute yourself, and everybody else can mute themselves, and we will get started. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this month's rendition of the Global Chamber Export Import Forum. I'm the moderator, Anita Rodal, president of SBPI Services. SBPI Services represents several currency exchange companies. We help global businesses reduce the cost and the risk of rate fluctuations on their cross-border payments. In the US, we also broker business and equipment loans for American companies, and I offer private pronunciation coaching via Zoom for foreign business professionals, diplomats, and actors who want to speak region neutral American English. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with the Global Chamber, it is a growing collaborative community of CEOs, executives, and business leaders in over 605 metro regions around the world. Today's forum is 55 minutes long. Sarita, unmute yourself for a second and say something, just one word to me. So I
Something.
want you to switch back. There you go. I wanted you to switch back to the thing. Okay, great. All right, I will continue. Today's forum is 55 minutes long. That's a trick, just so everybody knows. In the last 5 to 10 minutes, I will open it up for questions and answers. Why did I say that? Q&A and conversation. But until then, please, please, please keep yourselves on mute. I do have a couple of networking tips for everyone. First of all, it's a very good idea to use your full name. Not only on this webinar, but anytime you're on Zoom, use your first and last name, both of them. So you want to make it easier for people to find you, not harder. You want your networking dollars to go as far as they can. So if you need to rename yourself on here, just click on the three dots and you'll have an option of renaming yourself. And if you are a Global Chamber member, then put a little asterisk in front of your name. Um, you can also include all your contact information. That's always a good idea. Also, the link to your LinkedIn. That's very helpful as well. And then don't forget to save the chat. You want to save the chat so that you have it for future reference. And then you can find people. All right. So today we are so lucky to have the amazing Sarita Jackson, PhD, as our interviewee, as our guest. So let me tell you a little bit about Sarita. It's always hard, you know, weeding out all the million and one things that I could say about her, but we'll keep it brief. So, Dr. Sarita D. Jackson is a certified global business professional. Whether she's speaking in English or Spanish, Dr. Jackson is a bilingual international trade consultant and the founder of the Los Angeles based Global Research Institute of International Trade, or GRIT for short. Her expertise helps firms to grow their revenue by capitalizing on global market opportunities while also minimizing the risks with international trade. She has extensive experience in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Southern Africa. Dr. Jackson is a TEDx speaker and the author of the book entitled International Trade in Services, Effective Practice and Policy. Sorry to steal your thunder, Sarita, but she did already put the link in the chat. Another reason to save the chat. She currently serves as the chair of the Global Chamber Los Angeles Advisory Board, of which I am a member, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in broadcast journalism and Spanish from the University of Southern California and a PhD in political science from Brown University. Welcome, Dr. Jackson, although I will be calling you Sarita from here on out because we are all on a first name basis here at the Export Import Forum.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited and welcome to everyone that's on today's call.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, as you know, I always start off my interviews with three very quick icebreaker questions. It's kind of like speed dating. So, in 60 seconds or less, the first question is tell us how you got into this business.
Well, it all started with one question. What about international trade? And this goes back, as you mentioned, my PhD was from Brown University when I was working on my doctorate and was getting ready to go travel and live for a while in Panama. And I was trying to figure out what should I focus on with regard to political science. And there was someone that I met from the Panamanian government that mentioned international trade. And from that experience, I realized how international trade is related to political science, and that influenced my research when it comes to studying international trade negotiations and looking at the role of industry associations on the outcomes of these negotiations and then the impact on the economies and businesses. So from that point on, I have stayed with international trade from an academic perspective, and now as a business perspective, from a business perspective, running my own company, helping other companies to expand globally.
Okay, so I can actually sum all that up in 3 words: word of mouth. Somebody told you about international. I love that. Love it, love it, love it. Okay, what do you like the best about what you do?
Well, the thing that I really enjoy is the value. And when it comes to international trade, I know a lot of times we just talk about business transactions, but international trade is so much more than that for me. It all relates to economic development, economic growth, the impact on different communities. So being able to take the work that I do, not just from scholarly works, but from a practical level and having an impact when we're talking about different communities in, let's say, for example, developing economies and how they are impacted by international trade, or even here in the United States, small size companies, how they can leverage these opportunities. So the key thing is being able to provide value that extends beyond just being able to make a sale, an international sale.
Okay, got it, got it, got it. So, every coin has a flip side. What do you like the least about what you do?
Well, in terms of that question, it's not necessarily as it pertains to international trade, but just being a business owner. I'm sure many of us as entrepreneurs, it's just the fact that basically you are everything for that company. So, I'm my marketing, or at one point, not anymore, because my company is now 13 years old. It was founded in 2013. But in the very beginning, I was my own webmaster, accountant, doing the actual research, etc. But one of the things from that, what I did enjoy is that you're learning so many different skills, not just the technical aspect of what I do, but being able to learn how to communicate to different audiences about international trade that will promote or encourage them to take action so that they are successful. And then also the collaboration now, just before this call, I had 2 collaborations, people from the technological side to help me to advance my business, working with marketing, anyone in the finance area. So I'm no longer wearing all of those hats. I could just focus on scaling my company, but from that, being able to collaborate with others.
Okay, fantastic. All righty. So let's get into it. All right. When we talk about exporting a service, what types of services are we talking about?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, I'm talking about professional services, and just by the common definition of a professional service is that type of service that requires a specialized skill or training. For example, and let me just kind of back up because, the question is, all right, so I mean, yes, I gave the story of how I got into the field, but when it comes to actually importing and exporting from a practical perspective, I was
Mhm.
exporting a service as a consultant working for a firm in the Washington, D.C. area, a small firm. And I was exporting a consulting services while working with attorneys, accountants, different specialty areas that was required for a project. So that's where, for me, when I'm talking about exporting a service, it's those kinds of professional services. It could be a consulting service. It could be your accounting services, legal services, being a professor, educational services, healthcare services on many of those economic development projects, digital marketing services. So that's what I'm referencing when I talk about exporting a service.
Okay, wow. Lots of options, which is a good thing. So, what opportunities are available for U.S. exporters of services, would you say?
Mhm. Well, the key opportunity are our trade agreements. I really encourage service providers to begin with that. regardless of everything that you're hearing when it comes to tariffs and what
Mhm.
impact these have on our trade relations with longtime partners under these trade agreements, nonetheless, they still present opportunities for service providers to access new markets. And what do we mean by that access? It means that you will not face, under these agreements, you should not face discrimination when entering these markets, meaning that we're going to only select domestic providers and try to make it difficult for providers from different countries around the world to enter that market. And then also the regulatory barriers or non-tariff barriers, which is a huge issue when we're talking about services, because services are not hit by tariffs. Now, there are other costs that we can
For
talk
that.
about, but one being
Yeah.
the non-tariff barriers, the regulations and standards. Well, under these agreements, there are provisions put in these free trade agreements, or trade agreements are reciprocal. I prefer that term. There's no such thing as free trade. A reciprocal trade agreement, so that a service provider can access these markets and actually compete and do well in these markets, as opposed to trying to do it alone. And I've seen service providers try to do it alone, and it just doesn't work out very well.
You don't know what you don't know until you find out the hard way, basically.
Yes.
Not good. Alrighty. So, flip side of that question is what opportunities are available for service exporters? So, somebody in another country wanting to export their services into the United States.
United States. Yeah, when it comes to the United States, there are there's are plenty of opportunities for service providers based overseas or across the border that want to export to the United States. The one thing is, well, as far as any types of regulations that's prohibiting that, it's not as robust here in the United States. So that's one thing. So then for the service providers that are looking to take advantage of the opportunities, well, then this just comes down to, the basics of doing your homework. And this is where grit comes in, hence the research side of things, understanding the market, understanding the demographics, what the need is, how that service should be provided, any kind of local regulations or things that you need to be aware of in order to export your particular service to the United States.
Um, when you said robust, can you explain what you were referring to?
Meaning that there aren't any discriminatory practices or extremely difficult regulations that would make it difficult to more cumbersome to access the US market.
Yes. Dot, dot, dot. Okay. All right. So, how does one even go about finding new markets to export a service to?
Excellent question. Well, one of the things is it's really starting with looking at the trends. Now, when we're talking about manufactured goods or tangible goods, let's just say, so that could be a manufactured product or a food product, it's much easier because there's a lot of data that looks at the trends when it comes to, let's just stick with US exporters, right? What are we seeing with the US exports of a particular product to another market? And then starting from there to say, well, these are the top 3 to 5 markets. But services, you don't have that kind of data. It's building. There are some of the resources that I'm able to tap into, but when I work with service providers, when Grit works with service providers to identify these markets, we take the same approach and look at particular databases that have extensive information about services, not all jumbled up within goods, but
Mhm.
services alone, and taking that information, those statistics to say, okay, what is your particular service in your financial services sector? And what types of finance, what particular finance area are you in? Accounting, for example, then looking at those trends to say, okay, this is where we see these exports, and then based on the greatest amount of exports to those markets, that's where we are able to, at least as a starting point, to identify the markets to consider when exporting a service. Of course, there's more to that, but just for the
Yeah.
sake of, providing a starting point, it's looking at those international trade trends or statistics.
So I guess, with physical products, you've got so many touch points because it's physically, you know, it's something, something's being filed somewhere. It's going to a port. There is a record of, how many boxes, like everything has to be so, um, eh, everything is registered. Every touch point is recorded in terms of what it is, what it's made of, where it's going, where it's from. That's one of the things that makes physical products just so much easier to get data on because you
You have the
can literally see
documentation.
it.
That's the thing. You're
Right.
tracking it. Your bill of lading.
That's the
It's the
word I was looking
documentation.
for. Thank you. Okay. All right. So unfortunately, we do have to talk about the T word. I was trying to avoid it. It was everything that we ever did last year. However, I have to ask, do service exports face tariffs?
Technically, no, they do not face tariffs because
Okay.
the tariffs are what governments impose on the physical goods that are moving across borders, that are entering their market. But there's another T word that we need to
Not,
be
yes.
aware of, the taxes. There are
Oh,
taxes that are placed on service providers. And well, I'll just start with the more controversial one, that's the digital services taxes, because now what we've seen in the 21st century when we're talking about services, and I really go into detail about this in my book. And if you go in the chat and you see where I put my information, there's a YouTube channel focused on services and digital trade. And what we're seeing now, and this became even more prominent just within the last year, are these digital services taxes. So let's go back to that question about, when I talk about services, what am I referencing? Well, I mentioned healthcare, education, even consulting, or even this, we have Ruby from Ghana, right? And imagine, here I am, I'm providing tips, advice. This is a service that is being exported through digital means. So what some countries have started to do now is place a digital services tax where they're taxing the revenue that a company generates from providing that service through digital means, and it is being used in that particular country. So I am a supplier in the United States, but then someone in another country is utilizing the service and they're there locally. So that's what you're seeing more of when it comes to the taxes. And then also you have the value added tax, but that's
yeah.
neutral. That's not as controversial. It's the digital services because that's focusing on particular industries. So let's say, education, consulting, whatever the government decides, and that can be considered discriminatory.
Okay. So if any business is transacted that's not physical, then it would fall under the tax because
Yes.
it's still money is changing hands for something. I was getting worried when you said, well, even our conversation, like, well, where do you draw the line between free speech and having a conversation and actually monetizing it? But I guess the key word is monetization. So if
Mhm.
something, if there's business that happens as a result of the conversation, it's the business that gets taxed, you
Right,
know,
right,
not the
exactly.
conversation. Right.
Oh,
Okay.
no, no,
All right.
absolutely not.
Right.
No,
Oh,
and then
that's scary.
it's not just we're talking, right? It's I'm still providing a service, meaning
Right.
that, I'm helping you with something technical, not just, oh, we're conversing and you're going to get taxed.
Yeah. Yeah. If I pay you to talk to me, then that could be taxed, basically. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so there's still non-tariff trade barriers, and I see David Harlow on here, and we had a lovely conversation about that, as well as some other people. Um, are are there any that it could impact importers and exporters of a service, right?
Yes.
Non-trade non-tariff trade barriers to the extent that it's something other than taxes, what would that
Yeah.
entail?
So let's just be clear. When we talk about non-tariff barriers, they're not always, it's not a tax. That gets to regulations and standards. that one can play. So let me just quickly let's just quickly put that within the context of tangible goods. Then it'll make sense when I'm talking about services. So when you have non-tariff barriers, your tangible goods face these tariffs, but the non-tariff barriers are regulations. Let's say, for example, food. This is the easiest one, food standards. Now, yes, we want standards to make sure that food is healthy and safe for human consumption. However, where the lines can become blurred is when the standards are very cumbersome to make it difficult for that product to enter a market, where these standards really are used as a way of reducing outside competition. Because tariffs, yeah, we're talking about tariffs, but up until last year, tariffs really were not an issue in international trade because internationally they were very low, right? Like I said, up until last year. So it was the non-tariff barriers to trade that were an issue for products. When it comes to services, it's a similar thing. What are the requirements, regulations when it comes to intellectual property, licensing requirements? Any requirements when it comes to ownership? When we're talking about a company that is providing a service that is not from that particular country and they're trying to provide a service, what are the requirements when it comes to ownership? That's when it can become, if it is used so much, where it can become or be considered a barrier. That's what we mean by a non-tariff barrier. Anything that's not necessarily a tax or a tariff, well, non-tariff, that's placed on the good or a tax placed on the service, but it gets into any kind of regulations, standards, requirements that can be considered a barrier.
So to what extent are those used as deterrents and versus just generating revenue? Like, okay, you can come here and be a consultant, but if you do, you get to pay up like everybody else, or you get to pay more, like, like we do with our state universities. If you're from out of state, your taxes
Right.
aren't going to pay for it. So they're going to add on something
Yeah.
like that in terms of fees.
And so let me make sure I understood the question. So when does it become a deterrent to trade?
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
is
Asking?
it used? Are there countries, for example, that might use it as a deterrent versus others just say, you're welcome to come here, but if you do,
Mhm.
you're gonna, you
Right.
have to deal with these regs or fees or whatever it might be,
Mhm.
or
Excellent question.
registration.
So that's where what we have what's called a dispute settlement mechanism comes into play. So there's a larger process, right? So this gets into, now this kind of gets on the political science side of things in international relations. So you have institutions that govern these types of trade relations. And within that, and even within our trade agreements, that you have what's called a dispute mechanism or dispute settlement mechanism that's at the level of the trade agreements or the World Trade Organization. And this is where businesses, let's say, if a service licensing requirements are too difficult, well, the only way that's going to be considered or evaluated is if, let's say, the companies from one country says, okay, this is becoming too difficult for us. And this also happens with imports too, that it's the companies that will raise the issue, and then you have these mechanisms, these institutional mechanisms where it goes through a process of assessing whether these are actual barriers, if they're violating trade agreements or violating the rules set at the World Trade Organization level. Then that's where the final determinant is, okay, are these really restrictive or barriers? So there's a larger process that goes into that to make that determination.
Have you ever had to do that for a client, like guide them through that process or handle it for them with the
No,
dispute
I
resolution?
haven't. I haven't. And the reason being because many of the companies that I work with, as I say, I'm the very first step. So what they're trying to do is get the market intelligence first, and then
Uh-huh.
they're exporting. So I haven't, that's more kind of on the legal side of things. I haven't had to do that. However, I am, and a lot of this actually is covered in my newsletter and on my YouTube channel, where I talk about ways in which companies, like, for example, importers, right, importers,
Yes.
how you have been impacted, how you can get involved in the process and make your voice heard if you are impacted by some of these trade policies, whether it's how you're impacted here in the United States or overseas. For example, just very, very quickly, we had prior to the US Mexico Canada agreement, you had the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. We also have a trade agreement with the Central American countries and the Dominican Republic. And under that, a lot of times you saw where workers, from now more so from the employment side of things, or the labor side, would say, hey, this is unfair to us, when we're trying to compete, it's in violation of this agreement. So it takes that cohort, a group of people, to actually come together. So I provide the information about it because I am very well aware of it, being one that follows trade agreements and negotiations. But I have not had to work with the client because they're just really on this issue because they're just trying to figure out, well, I need the intelligence to make the best possible decision. And then I want influence driven information and get my product or my service in that market. So that's usually the nature of the relationship with my clients.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So, what other costs do people need to be aware of if they are exporting services?
Let's see, outside, I mean, though, that's pretty much it, quite frankly, in terms
Okay.
of the taxes, the digital services tax, any value added tax, and then any non-tariff barriers to consider when they're expanding to the market, just from the international trade perspective. Now, of course, other costs are just the basic cost of running a business. And
Well,
then to
yeah,
take
no,
into
that's
account the costs, trying to now you're not just operating locally or nationally, just whatever costs expanding, just running a business, expanding internationally. But as far as specific to international trade, I just reiterate looking at any kinds of taxes that a country will place on services, and then also any additional non-tariff barriers, which are your regulations or any kind of standards when entering that market.
so on the digital services taxes, for example, is what what are there particular countries that do charge that? I'm sure anybody could at some time, if they don't
Mhm.
now, that's not to say they won't in the future, but like does that exist in the Eurozone or could an individual country decide to slap it on without the entire Eurozone following suit, that
Well,
kind of thing?
Well, the one case that comes to mind when I mentioned that it was a bit a controversy last year was Canada. Canada, and as we all know, that we have a trade agreement with Canada under the U.S. Mexico Canada Agreement or USMCA. Canada was going to implement a digital services tax, but then Canada ended up not doing so because the United States responded and made it very clear that you remove this tax or else. And then it was removed. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And we do not have one on our end for anybody bringing their services in
No,
digitally.
no.
Okay, good. All right, happy to hear that. All right, so let's see. What other types of challenges should U.S. service exporters evaluate when entering new markets?
Yeah. Okay, great question. One is the competition, of course. Competition, making sure, because even you can see this and this was one of the issues even with NAFTA when NAFTA took effect in 1994, and it has its provisions for service providers where some service providers were still found it difficult to enter the Mexican market, even though you have these provisions to allow for cross-border trade in the services sector. There can be other types of practices. Well, I guess this goes back to the non-tariff barriers that can make it more difficult to enter that market, or that can be considered discriminatory when entering that market. And then the other thing is, depending on where you're trying to go, language, understanding the language, the culture, how a service should be provided, similar to just even with products. You have to make sure that your product is adaptable to and presented in a way that it is used in another market and that it follows whatever kind of requirements. The same with services, that you really understand that market. And that's where grit comes in. And I did last year even though I was working a lot with companies that were manufacturing a product or really in the tech space, quite frankly, there were service providers, and it was really doing a deep dive to understand that, first of all, understand their business, not just, hey, here's a market, go, but to really understand their business. What are your resources? What's your vision? Do you have the capability to really expand? And then once we identify that market that makes sense for your particular service, to really understand what is needed for that market, the demographics and people's values in that market. Now, for me, it's easier, like even though I've done work regardless of country, but because I've lived and worked in these areas, Latin America, and then some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's much easier for me. For example, last year, where someone was going to Mexico, and then I said, well, this is what our report says. However, because I've lived in different parts of Mexico, I can tell you some things to think about that you're not going to find written anywhere when you start trying to expand, depending on what part of Mexico, so on and so forth. So to really understand the culture, the language, how that service is presented or should be presented, and then also your competition, mainly to understand the competition on the ground, and then what kinds of regulations may have an impact on you.
So as we're talking about digital stuff, something that just popped into my mind, because even companies in the US don't really adhere to this, but the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, kind of dictate that everybody on their website should have the
Mhm.
visual and the audio capabilities, to adjust. Not everybody's completely blind. Some people, can't see contrast very well. So there's all these things. However, there's no uniform avenue or obligation from any of these web hosters to provide the services. So, is that something that somebody from another country coming in here would want to be compliant with? And do other countries, to your knowledge, maybe you haven't dealt with this, do they have similar things for, just visually impaired people if you're working with something digital, if that's like how they access your product is digitally?
Yeah, so absolutely for anyone coming into the US, yes, that's very important. I mean, and as you mentioned, just your website alone to make sure that it is accessible. Now, when looking at other countries, I have not quite dealt with the issue of ADA or disabilities or addressing some of those challenges. But one area that really comes to mind when it comes to digital services for companies to be aware of is when it comes to data protection and privacy. That has been an issue that continues to come up. And what's interesting, I had a call, one of my calls this morning, we were talking about this, where someone that's his area with kind of some of the regulations. And what we are seeing now is that when it comes to privacy, we all know that European unions, the GDPR, how you protect your data, your privacy, and that sets the standard. But what we are seeing now is, there isn't a harmonized approach internationally to deal with that issue when it comes to technology and protecting your users or the user data. Now, because you know because there's so things have shifted so much just within the last year. Now there are so many countries that are saying, well, what we're going to do, we're going to set our own standards. So it's not as if here's one standard, whether I go to South Africa or France or an EU country. Now it's becoming even more more important that a service provider, especially if you're using digital means, understands what are the regulations in that particular country that are setting their standards that you have to follow. So that's the main thing when it comes to exporting out and understanding what different countries are doing. So that data protection, privacy laws for the use of technology.
Okay, no, that makes perfect sense. So conversely, and you've touched on some of this, but maybe there's something else. What are some of the challenges that service providers, service exporters face when they're trying to access our market here in the US? I know you said that we have less barriers, but
Right. Yeah.
challenges
I
might be something else.
Yeah, it really just comes down to, in that case, is understanding the market. And I say this, and it seems simple, but the conversations I've had in the last few years with companies where they want to come to the U.S. market, And it's just like, Dr. Jackson, just can you provide this service? And it's no, it may or may not work. I know you want to come to, I'm located in Los Angeles, California. It may or may not work. And when I ask questions of, first of all, who's the end user? What's the value? Have you even really taken the time to understand the United States? The United States, even regionally, there are so many differences. Have you even taken the time? No, it's just, I know you get my service into that market, and it just does not work that way. So the short answer is really take the time to understand the market, the value, who would utilize this service, understand the demographics and how they would use that service, and then to develop a strategic approach. And that's one of the things. Another part with Grit is we focused on having a very focused, narrow, focused strategic approach, not just an ad hoc approach to doing business, right? To really develop a strategy that is focused so that you can succeed over the long term, not just, oh, I provided my service to so and so over here. Okay, so what happened after that? Well, that was, a year ago. We think long term.
And so if you get it right in one, if you become kind of very well versed in one area, then it can be adjusted and used somewhere else. But if you don't go through the groundwork or the
Right.
grunt work, if you will, of mastering that. And I think sometimes people, I don't know why anybody would think of the US as a homogenized market because it's anything but. Even from Northern
Yes.
California to Southern California, it's like two different worlds.
Yes.
So multiply every state, maybe times two at least. And, nobody would ever think that the EU is a single cohesive
Right.
personality, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just so many different countries. Okay, let's see. What are you seeing in terms of service export trends to and from the US? Like, can you track what's
Mm-hmm.
happening, where things are going, what's hot, what's not?
Yeah. Well, one interesting thing when it comes to the services trends is that you continue to see an increase in service exports. So our exports are greater than our imports, hence the surplus when it comes to our services trade. And this is why, for me, this is such an important topic that gets overlooked. When we talk about trade, it comes back to our policies. What's the goal of the policy? To reduce the trade deficit, of course, generate revenue, grow the economy. But the way that you do that is you reduce the deficit. Well, when we look at those numbers, actually, it could be worse. The only thing that's saving it from, I mean, it's bad enough as it is. The deficit is bad. It's like, debt. Any debt for me, at least, is bad, right? But it could be worse. And the reason why it's not to the degree that it really could be is because the United States has a surplus, meaning that the United States exports more than it imports. Now, overall, when we look at services, that you continue to see an increase in services, and then mainly with transport and travel, makes sense on the global scale. Then when we just look just from December of 2025 to December 2024, and I'm just speaking here in the United States, where you continue to see an increase in terms of the revenue generated from services, anywhere from 7 to 9%, depending on the particular types of service. And that's, of course, your transport, travel, your financial services, healthcare, education. So you see an increase in service. So that, to me, that just means that, yeah, there are continuous opportunities. And then the last thing I want to mention, when we look at many economies, and this is one of the things that's also highlighted in my book, not just here in the United States, but many economies, emerging economies, where the majority of their economy relies on the services sector. Some a little over 70% relies on the services sector. So then that's something that they can consider to export, whether it's to the United States or to other countries around the world, that could really benefit from that service.
Thank you. That's amazing. Okay, real quick, because then I want to open it up for questions. Um, how does grit help service providers expand globally? Like, give us the overall
Mhm. Yeah.
summary.
So, so when I'm working with a client, and we'll take, I'm just thinking of the more recent services-based clients, it starts off with the first step is really understanding that company, right? So that whatever information is provided to them so that they can make the best possible decision is customized. It is not a general, these are the steps you need to take. First, I need to understand what resources does your company have in order to move forward. That's number one. Then number two, we answer the question why. I always tell people grit doesn't tell you the how or what. Yeah, that's a part of the process. But what distinguishes grit from other companies is we do the why. This is where the academic background comes in. Why am I doing, why am I going to this market over that market? So starting with understanding the country, the company and its resources, et cetera. Then we do that data analysis that I referenced earlier, looking at some of the international trade trends to say, okay, this is why this market makes sense for you. We'll have 3 to 5 markets, but based on your resources, it makes sense to go to this one market. Then we do an in-depth analysis of the market, looking at the political, the economic, regulations, everything that they need to know about that market, and then provide a strategy that makes sense for that company. It's like telling a story. I'm not going to give you a general story. I'm going to tell a story that makes sense for you. I'm going to tell the story of your life that makes
Mhm.
sense when you're entering that market so that you could succeed over the long term. And then we get to the execution phase. And that's where partnering with individuals from different angles, attorneys, for example, customs brokers, freight forwarders. Well, that's for obviously for the goods, people that have different specialties where they can help financing on the execution side for that client.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and last question, because anybody who writes a book, it's a labor of love. It's exhausting, but you do it because you just feel compelled. So, excuse me. So, why was it important for you, to write a book on international trade and services?
Yeah. Well, it became apparent that there was a gap in the practical side of things. And what I mean by that is when I started my company in 2013, I moved back from Los Angeles. I was up and down the East Coast living internationally for 13 years. So I moved back in 2013, set up Grit, and I attended a workshop on international trade. And I noticed everyone was talking about goods. Makes sense because we're here with the Port of Los Angeles. And I asked the question, I said, but, the United States exports more services than we import. We have a surplus there. Can anyone tell me about what's going on with services? And the response was, oh, we don't have those numbers. We're not sure. So I thought, we're doing all of these workshops. And then when I became more active leading workshops, most of the people in the room were service providers. When I taught courses in different business schools, it was the same thing. Someone would come up, I would talk about services exports based on my own experience. And students would say, well, is there anything we could reference? Now, yes, there are texts out there, but they're very technical. It's more so what's going on with the World Trade Organization when it comes to services trade, but nothing practical. And for that reason, I thought, well, while everyone's still talking about tariffs and manufactured goods and all of that, which is still very important, let's bring light to those service providers, bring light the information that will guide those service providers that are in the room, that's at these workshops, that's giving them information about moving tangible goods. So that was where writing this book became very, very important to provide value to the service providers who are currently exporting and don't know it, or those who are thinking about exporting and want to know how to get started and
Did you
get the
say they're
funding
at
to.
did you say they're currently exporting and don't know it?
Yeah, there are some people, yes, where they don't realize you're already exporting. And especially
Oh,
with
funny.
technology, it makes it that much easier. They do not consider themselves exporters. And so just letting them know you actually are exporting your service because you're providing your service to someone in another market, in another country, and they're paying you for that. And then it's, oh, really?
eye-opening. That's fantastic. I love it. So you can literally say you wrote the textbook, and Sarita used to, maybe you still do. She used to teach a class for UCLA Extension, which is one of the most renowned extension programs in the US. And I was honored to be asked to do a talk on currency exchange to her students pre-pandemic. So, alrighty. So then, you know what? We are going to now open it up to any questions or conversation. Everyone can unmute. If you have a question, hit Alt Y, or if your version of Zoom has a little like raise hand icon, you can use that as well. If you have any questions for Sarita, and if there are no questions, then I will ask a question, which is, what didn't I ask that I should have asked during our conversation?
Mm. Well, I would say, even though I addressed it, but one is what can we expect with services trade in 2026 in the midst of everything that's going on? Because even the services trade is shifting. So so it goes back to what I was saying, like with data protection, privacy, technology, providing services through the use of technology. We're seeing now more rules and regulations governing even the technology, which will have an impact on service providers. So that's the main thing that I would encourage looking forward for the remainder of the year. What are these different regulations, whether they're from the United States or even countries, where they are coming up with different regulations that will have an impact on service providers, not just the digital services tax, if other countries are doing that, but other types of regulations that's related to the technology, the digital trade that will have an impact on service providers.
Okay. And without violating any privacy agreements or anything, what is the most interesting service you've ever been asked to assist a client with?
When you say from my end or the service that they provide?
Well, that somebody came to you that said, I need help with this, that you just kind of went, wow, haven't seen that one before.
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see.
I mean, I don't know, maybe there isn't one, but just in case there
Yeah,
was,
no,
I do
but
want to
there
know.
could be, right? Within 13 years, I'm sure there's been something that's interesting. Oh, okay, here we go. Here we go. Well, okay, so it's not necessarily working for service providers, and David Harlem has some comments on this. I will say the interesting one was when it comes to how you classify your products, right? And and I tell everyone I am not an international trade attorney. I'm not a licensed customs broker. Like, I do know how to read the harmonized tariff schedule. Uh, yeah, the key word harmonize. Going back to what
Right.
I was saying, unfortunately, when it comes to services, things aren't as harmonized. So, and reading the harmonized tariff schedule and helping, but I
Mhm.
would say it was someone that had emailed me, and basically it was trying to get me to sign off on however they classified their product. They said, "Can I just do this without hiring an attorney or working with a licensed customs broker?" And I said, I am not going to answer whatever code you came up with your product. I am not going to get myself in trouble, number one, in writing. And number two, please go back and speak with the experts, right? But it was trying to get me to sign off. I think that's the most interesting, I don't know. That's the first thing that comes to mind, but that's a great question. But it was just more so kind of signing off on things without really seeking the professional expertise required.
But it wasn't a particular service that, you said there's people that don't even realize they're exporting. Well, is there something that you never previously thought of as a service export that somebody surprised you? You're like, wow, yeah, I guess you could do that. Nothing
Oh,
surprises you.
really? Yeah, I think because I was in the midst of it, working with service providers on different things. So not anything from the service side. And watch, when I get off this call, something might pop into my head. But
Well,
for
let me know. We can
now,
always send it out. Yeah.
yeah, there we go. There, I write a comment in the YouTube when it's on YouTube. But as far as a service, yeah, pretty much. I mean, everything just kind of falls in, with what I'm used to working with or seeing, having. been overseas working with, so many different areas. Like I know I mentioned the easier ones, the legal, the accounting, but there are so many interesting services that I've seen. So nothing really surprised me.
Okay. All right. Okay. Fantastic. All right. And none of those interesting ones or anything that we might not have heard of.
Of service providers?
Yeah. Like, because you mentioned it could be accounting, it could be legal, da da da, but what else is there?
Oh,
I'll bet you
those,
Ruby might know. She has her hand raised. Ruby, do you have
oh,
any
I don't
ideas? You've
oh
I'm
probably
yeah,
not
I
had
saw
something
seeing
her
that.
interesting.
hand
How come
raised.
I'm
Yeah,
not
she is.
seeing that? I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to ask Sarita, hi. Um, what are you passionate about? I mean, what do you do outside work? If you like to share that with us, that would be nice.
Okay. Also, non-work related stuff you're asking me about? Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. Oh Lord. Okay. Many people know I love salsa dancing. And I recently, yeah, and I mentioned this to Anita, that recently joined an orchestra because I grew up, most people don't know about me that I grew up studying classical piano. So now that's one of the other hobbies that I do where I play with a local orchestra, the piano. But yeah, but definitely it's salsa dancing or any other kind of Latin dancing. We'll just say Latin dancing. So dancing and piano music. That's a great
nice,
Love it.
question.
very nice.
Love it. Yeah, you're not showing up, Ruby, so I was not able to see. Oh, because your camera is not on. That's why. Okay.
Yeah, the
Um,
hand signal was up
yeah,
for
I'm
so
her.
it's
frozen.
not showing up on the screen here. Anybody else have any? And also, just Sarita is a warrior when it comes to working out. She like does a boot camp.
Oh yes, I do my yeah, 3 times a week boot camp.
Yes, makes me tired just thinking about it.
Well, one quick thing I just before someone has a question, one thing when you ask, education was one where a lot of times that's where I would get people to where they didn't realize they were exporting a service when it came to education because think of COVID, right? During the global health pandemic, a lot was provided through digital means. And then when I said, "Do you realize you're exporting a service?" Never thought about it. You're no longer in the classroom. You are now providing a service. And at that time, I was still with UCLA Extension. I still am. But at that time, it was many of the students couldn't travel to the US anymore. So then
Right.
I'm talking to students located in different parts of the world. That's exporting the service.
So here's a question for you. Like if two people are on Zoom, like I do pronunciation coaching,
Mhm.
somebody comes onto my Zoom, aren't they like importing themselves into my world? I'm not really going into their world.
You
Like, how do you
meaning,
decide two people are on a Zoom call?
mhm.
Okay,
And
wait.
you're
So
charging, I
I'm
take it.
charging,
Yeah,
so I'm exporting in
right.
theory. Yeah,
So
okay,
they
yeah,
are
yeah,
consuming because they're located somewhere else, let's say
right.
in Spain. So they
Yeah,
are they are utilizing it in that country, but you're located over here. And then what's bridging that gap? What's
right.
that freight forwarder, if you will? It's your Zoom call
Okay.
that's connecting
Okay, got it. Yeah,
connecting.
I was
Mhm.
okay. That makes perfect sense. Okay, is there anybody else that I'm missing? Because it's 4 minutes before the hour, and I like to finish early so you have time to take a break before your next call. Okay. So let me thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and especially Sarita Jackson. It was amazing talking with you and sharing your knowledge with everybody because I can call you anytime, but this is for the wider audience. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, I hope you'll join us next month. We're always on the fourth Thursday of the month at noon Pacific time. So the next one will be on Thursday, March 26th. And in the meantime, be sure you check out the globalchamber.org events calendar. There is always something going on somewhere in the world. And if you can't sleep here in California, you could hop on a call with Japan or Australia or somebody else. So enjoy that, take advantage of it, and I hope to see y'all next.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you. Take care.